Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 6 of the Proslogion, Anselm first raises a puzzle which he will consider at multiple times throughout his works, and which is a quite common one raised over and over again through the centuries by many people, even down to the present. And in Chapter 7, he's going to provide a full analysis of this problem, one that I think could be quite useful for many people in the present. So the puzzle is one about divine omnipotence. And he doesn't raise any silly questions like, can God create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? It's more of a broad consideration. How is it that God, who we say is omnipotent, is really omnipotent when there's things that he can't do? We don't have to come up with conundrums like imaginary stones. We can point to things that we human beings seem to be able to do and say, well, why can't God do that? If God is omnipotent, maybe his omnipotence is really, in some respects, bounded, or it's a lack of power. So what can't God do? Anselm gives you 3 examples here, but then he raises the possibility of all sorts of others, and so we could consider some other examples as well. God, he says, cannot be corrupted. That is, he can't break down. He is what he is, and that's it. As a matter of fact, Anselm will say that God is perfectly simple, God doesn't change, God exists from eternity, and all of those things seem pretty fixed, don't they? So what kind of God is it if he or it or whatever God is can't sort of change the scheme of the universe or change his own mind about things? That seems to be a bit of a problem. Being corrupted, God can't break down. God doesn't have any parts, but God can't become less powerful or forget things or anything along those lines. He also can't tell lies. That seems to be a really big restriction, doesn't it? God can't, come up with a false story and give it to somebody else. It seems like being able to tell a lie would actually be a power, wouldn't it? If I tell you that I'm 50 years old right now, which will be true before too long, when I'm actually 48, right now I'm telling you a lie, especially if I'm doing it to deceive. Anselm's notion of lie is fairly broad, we could say, but that's a topic for another time. God also can't exercise, it seems, the great power that he or it or whatever God is possesses to turn what's true into what's false, or vice versa. Can't make something that's false true. And the example that Anselm uses here is being able to undo what has been done. So, the sorts of things that we make into rather mundane sci-fi or fantasy postulates about being able to change the past or undo things that have been produced or made the case. God can't do that sort of thing. Doesn't that seem like a real restriction of the divine power? And then he follows it up by saying there's all sorts of similar things, plura similiter, right? There's many other things in the same way that God can't do. Isn't this a problem? What would those include? In the Cur Deus Homo, he talks about God not being able to sin. God not being able to suddenly take whatever is just and make it unjust, or vice versa. And Anselm has sort of the same standard line that other earlier thinkers who considered this before him has. If God were to do that, then God would not be God. It would not be God that's doing that. It would be some other being. But here the analysis turns on what power really means and what omnipotence genuinely means. So the question we can ask here that puts everything in context is, if God were able to do these sorts of things, if God could become corrupted, if God could tell lies, if God could take the true and make it false, or vice versa, would this actually be power, potentia in Latin, or capacity if you like, or would this be in some way impotence, or a lack of power, impotentia, the privative of potentia, right? And if we think about what it means to be impotent, Anselm has a very interesting observation here. If you think about a person, right? Somebody who can do these sorts of things, like lie, or become unjust, or sin, or be corrupted, somebody who can do these sorts of things is able to do what is not good for that person. In Latin, quod sibi non expedit, what is not expedient or what is not beneficial for that person. So the fact that I can lie is not actually a good thing for me, because it means that there's something damaged or lacking, some deficit within myself. And it also allows us to do what we ought not to do, quod non debet. And so what if God could do these sorts of things? That would mean that God then could actually do what's not good for God, or what does not, suit God, you could say, and what God ought not to do. Anselm goes on a little bit further and he adds something else to this. The more, he's using this quanto tanto thing, there's a degree over here and a corresponding degree over here, and that's the Latin way of expressing it. The more that a person can do these sorts of things, the more that something else has power over that person, and the less that person has power in relation to those things. And what are they? Well, we just transliterate them here into English. Adversity, adversitas, right? And perversity, perversitas, right? The more that these actually have power over that person. So let's take lying, for example. The more that a person is able to lie, perhaps they don't really care much about the truth, the more that adversity can push them into lying. The more that they can be compelled to lie, the more that their desires can take control over them. Perversity doesn't necessarily mean, as we often think about it today, sexual perversity. It means any sort of turning away or to the side from where we ought to be. So if I, for example, as a teacher, ought to be presenting Anselm in a faithful way, perversity would be presenting Anselm so that it makes me look good, or something like that, right? And the more that I have this seeming capacity to do things, the more that that perversity or adversity would actually control me, would actually be the one or the thing or the motive deciding for me, pushing me in certain ways. So I'm not really powerful by being able to do these things. As a matter of fact, being able to do these things is a sign of a lack of power. And so Anselm says we really need to analyze this idea, this term that we throw around so easily, of potentia or power. If we want to understand omnipotentia, the power to do all, then we need to first understand what power is. And he actually devotes a lot of space to that in other works. But what we have here is a nice discussion where he says that We often use words improperly, as, for example, when we use to be for not to be, or to do for not to do, or for to do nothing. So he says, we often say to someone who denies that something exists, it is as you say it. We use this word for non-being, for being, right? Or the reverse. And we confuse ourselves in a way because we're talking about something that isn't the case as if it is the case. So that's one way we do that. He also says, we say the man is sitting just as we say that man is doing something. Sitting is not really doing, it's a not doing something else, not standing. Or we say the man is resting just as we say the man is doing something. To rest is to do nothing. So then Anselm says, in the same way, so he's drawing an analogy here, when someone is said to have the power, the potentia, when somebody's said to have the power of doing something, right, or suffering something which is not to his advantage, which is not suitable to him, or which he ought not to do, then by power, what we really mean is a lack of power, an impotence. I almost said omnipotence, but rather impotence. An impotence in relation to something else which is going to be driving us and calling the shots. Something else is more powerful than us, so it's not strictly speaking correct to say that we are powerful by being able to do these things. Rather, we are able to be subjected to the power of other things that then has us doing these sorts of things like lying or making true things into false, which doesn't always have to be about changing the past, right? It could be about changing ourselves as true human beings into depraved human beings, and we could go on and on and on. None of those things are fitting for God. And as a matter of fact, it wouldn't be omnipotence to be able to do any of those things. So what this leads us to is the realization that we actually had the notion of omnipotence wrong, and that's why we had this puzzle. If we see things correctly, as Anselm says, then we conclude that God is more truly omnipotent. And he uses that term various there. God is really omnipotent, not just the sort of simplistic conception of omnipotence that we had in our head before we carried out this analysis. So this allows that puzzle to be at least explained, if not necessarily dispelled. And you could take other examples and similarly apply this same line of reasoning to that. And this helps Anselm to say how God genuinely is omnipotent.